All right. So we should be going live. It looks like it's live on my screen.
Right. It's not on mine, but Terry, do an intro.
All right. So welcome to Faith on Friday. I'm Terry McHugh and with Pastor Chip Freed and Pastor Harry Lee for Faith on Friday. And Harry's the lead pastor of Mosaics Church out in Arkansas, and he will be telling us more about that. But as we get started, just want to welcome anybody that's joining in. We welcome you to ask questions on the chat, and we'll try to get to those. And our focus is, as we posted earlier, is on cultural intelligence, or CQ. And I'm really excited to hear Harry share a little bit more. And Pastor Chip is trained in CQ as well. So let's get started.
All right, man. So I'm glad if you're with us around Cleveland to introduce you to a colleague and friend of mine, a leader in the whole multi-ethnic church movement. And many of you know the work that I've done with Mark DeMaz, and he's been up this way, and the teaching that we do. Harry's been with Mark for how many years now, Harry?
Almost 18, almost the same
years.
as
Okay.
you guys.
Yeah.
So you know we have to get, you guys know how Pastor Terry and I frickin' frack and get along. And so whenever you're in ministry together for 16 to 18 years, it's a good team. But I've really grown to appreciate Harry, and we're going to talk about cultural intelligence. We'll dive into that a little bit. Mosaics now is the provider of CQ, is what's called cultural intelligence training for faith-based organizations. This training has blown up way beyond faith-based organizations. So we'll talk about how Mosaics came into there. But Harry, just you've not been up to Cleveland with us yet. That day will come. But I've had the privilege to work with Harry, and just love hearing his call story, his background. He has a PhD in engineering, which it just blows my mind. Wouldn't have been near smart enough. What did you make as your senior project? A nitrogen laser?
That's right. It was a nitrogen laser.
Yeah, like he made that for his senior project in high school. I was trying to figure out how to do, spitballs with a big, so he's out of my league. But Harry, talk a little bit, just introduce yourself, about your background, your story, and how you came to be a lead pastor in the multi-ethnic church movement.
Man, I hope we got enough time for all that. I was like,
we got an hour.
What's very interesting about my story is that I'm the son of two first-generation immigrants from China, and they both came to the U.S. to go to college. And my dad was working on his master's in engineering, my mother her undergrad, and they came from two completely different parts of China. And they went to two different colleges. But while they were in school here, the revolution happened and they got stuck here. Now, I don't know how much everybody knows about their Chinese history, but in 1949, when the communist movement started, it was absolute turmoil in China, and the government here in the US was not about to let any of the 5,000 college students that were currently enrolled in the US go home, because they didn't want Western educated minds fueling this burgeoning communist movement. So they wouldn't let them leave, but they did give them green cards. And so my dad had just finished his master's in engineering from the University of Michigan. I know it's one of your favorite schools up in Ohio.
You see what I'm wearing, right?
And because he didn't have anything else to do, he went to visit his best friend from China, who was also studying at Georgia Tech. And while there, he met a professor who invited him to keep going for his PhD. So he was a very smart man, and just simply because he had nothing better to do, he kept going and got his PhD in chemical engineering from Georgia Tech, and then graduated there in 1954 and took his one and only job as a research engineer for DuPont back in those days, right outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so they had a huge nylon plant. I don't even think that plant exists today. But my mother, on the other hand, was one of the first international students to enroll at Furman University in South Carolina. And so much of this has just come up pretty recently. But she talked about how she had to take a very long, slow boat from China to San Francisco. She was from Guangzhou. Now, back then it was called Canton. And she was a beautiful little petite Chinese girl, 18, 20 years old. She got to San Francisco and she had to take a cross-country train ride to South Carolina after she did that long boat ride. And she said so much of that trip she spent in locking herself in the bathroom because people would not leave her alone, wanted to know who she was, what she was, just such an oddity at that time. But she graduated and then moved to Chattanooga to pursue her master's degree. And so that's where they met. And, there were so few Chinese back in those days in Chattanooga. And she actually told me recently that the only way you could have Chinese food is if you made it. And so the little handful of Chinese co-eds that were at University of Chattanooga back in that day would go buy their food, but there was only one professional that had a kitchen in his house, and that was my dad. So she said he got the pick of the litter and courted her heavily. And so they got married in 55. And my brother was born and my sister was born, and I ended up being born in 60. They almost took the whole family back to China because of his cultural obligation to go back and take care of his mother. And just before he could, she died. So they ended up just staying in Chattanooga. So I always just say, outside of my house, man, I lived a Southern boy experience, but inside it was such a traditional Chinese household. And you never questioned Papa. Yeah. And there was just always this huge expectation on me to excel in education, And so he never demanded it. He just always assumed I was going to keep going and excelling. And so I followed his footsteps and got my PhD in electrical engineering at Georgia Tech. And so that was all back in like 1990. Met my wife in Atlanta, got married, and then spent 10 years at the University of Idaho, where a lot of my years there was doing research for NASA. And so we were doing what it was called one of a kind, first of a kind development of electronics for deep space. And it was such a wonderfully exciting research topic for us, because nothing existed. They would ask us to make these parts, but there weren't even people that could make them. So we had to kind of work alongside all the foundries, like Honeywell and places like that to build the parts, just to test the part and prove that it worked. But that was the kind of thing I really enjoyed. But halfway through that career, God just totally gripped my heart. It was just one of those things where it was really the first time I'd been a Christian since I was 21. But he showed me what could happen if I seriously focused on my spiritual growth. And it was no longer me having to just be discipled by somebody, but it was just me and him in my office early in the morning. We had 2 small kids, so whenever they'd wake me up early, I'd just go into my office and have these long, massive times with God. And he so changed my life and my heart that I began wondering, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? Am I supposed to be a professor? I'm wondering if maybe God wanted me to be a pastor. And when I told my wife, Melanie, that, the first thing she said was, "You married the wrong woman." And it's just like, the last thing I ever want to be is a pastor's wife. And I had to seriously wait 3 years for God to speak to her and just to ask her to come along this journey with me. And so it got to the point where I was so desperate on what to do. I just told God I would go anywhere he wanted me to go and do anything he wanted me to do, as long as he just made it clear. No more than 10 days after praying that prayer, I was in Arkansas doing research with a colleague at the University of Arkansas. And in the process, met Mark DeMoss over a cup of coffee one day. And I just said that was the beginning of so many sleepless nights. It was just it was one of those clarion calls for me. I mean, seriously, when he painted that picture, I didn't even know a multi-ethnic church even existed, or that a church would be started for the purpose of displaying, this picture of Revelation 7. But as soon as he said it, there was just something deep in me that just went, man, that sounds so right. And so I went back home, and, it took us 9 months to kind of sort out the call, 2 trips back to Arkansas. And of course, Mosaic wasn't even birthed at the point when Mark and I first met. By the time we came down, there was actually a leadership board, and they basically said, hey, we want you to come join us, be on our pastoral staff, and we think we can pay you $24,000 a month. And then the rest you got to bring on our own. And that was all we came on. It wasn't a letter with nothing but a phone call saying, we think we can pay you $2,000 a month. But quit my job, moved my family 2,000 miles, and started pastoring Mosaic in the fall of 2002. And
Wow.
It's been an adventure ever since.
I'm glad you clarified 2,000 a month, because initially you said 24,000 a month.
Yeah.
People were like, hey, yeah, pick me. No, but,
So
anyhow, if you just tune in, I know people are jumping in. I'm seeing some of you jump in on Facebook, and those I can't see. Please, Pastor Terry, ask some questions. But my colleague and good friend Harry Lee with Mosaic's Global Network. Harry and I work together as part of the core team for that movement. And Harry is the lead pastor of Mosaic Church in Little Rock. And so we're going to talk about something called CQ, Cultural Intelligence. I've just spent the last 2 days kind of being Robin to Harry's Batman, as he was leading this training that we're going to talk to you about with a mega church in Indianapolis, 140 staff members. So that gives you a sense of the size of the church, and broke them up for 70 each day in 2 6-hour flights. I only did 2 3-hour flights with Harry. I left him hanging for the other ones. But he's such a great articulator of this concept and this vision mission. Let me just share my screen real quick. If you want to know what we're talking about, this is the book. This is the main book that I first came across. It's David Livermore is the author. And you may not know this, but David Livermore was a missionary. He's a Christian. CQ, kind of like Strength Finders we were talking about last week, is not a Christian-based or a faith-based assessment. But basically what happened is it's grown so much. David Livermore's customers include like the US military, Coca-Cola, I think Google or Apple, I forget which one. So was looking for a provider for faith-based groups and settled on Mosaics. And Harry's been further down the road than me. I am certified in CQ training and train the trainer and unconscious bias, but that's been pretty recent. Our staff, or at least our pastoral staff, we went through CQ training in 18, so a couple years ago. So we were familiar with it, but this is really interesting. I'm going to have Harry talk to you about it. Let me just say quickly that you've heard about IQ, and you've heard about even emotional intelligence, EQ. But what David Livermore and their group began to study was cultural intelligence, now called CQ. How do we navigate? How do we live in this diverse world, in this global community that emerged, that puts us in multi-ethnic, multicultural experiences? And so businesses had to learn how to do it. Schools had to learn how to do it. And the church, unfortunately, it was a little slow to the party. We're still learning how to do it. Mosaics was launched, I think, in 2002, Mosaic Little Rock. Mm-hmm. I came to Garfield in 2004. I had previously transitioned to a oldest historical African-American church in Northeastern Ohio from 93 to 98. So, but there were outliers of people doing these kind of things. Now it's kind of emerged as a movement. And so Harry's really leading us into how we understand cultural intelligence in the church world. And so Garfield Memorial is something you'll probably be hearing more about. But in those of you in Cleveland, and we know there's other pastors here, you can do this with your churches. You can do it in organizations. So Harry, give us the CQ for dummies. And I'm probably still a dummy, but at least I am in the water. What is CQ? Talk to us about it.
Yeah, well, it's really just like you said, it's an additional layer. All right. There's EQ, there's IQ, of course, and they say that really doesn't change a whole lot over the course of a person's life. Then there's the emotional intelligence, which is really, really important for all leaders, especially leaders of diverse people. And that can improve with life, but on top of that, really it should be cultural intelligence, where you actually learn so much more beyond just the emotional part, because you learn how do people use those emotions to resolve conflict. How do they think about authority? How do they think about time orientation? Are they task oriented or people oriented? There's so many cultural dynamics associated with that. And CQ essentially helps you become a student of those cultures, and then it measures you in ways that shows how effective you are in engaging those, especially not like you. So it doesn't matter where you come from or what cultural setting you've been raised in. CQ will essentially measure how effectively are you at engaging those that are not from where you are, and so it's a really, really valuable tool. What I say is this is a framework, it's a model. It allows you to look at the scriptures through the lens of culture and pick out things you probably never even imagined or thought about from a cultural perspective. But there's so much culture in the Bible, just feel chock full of these culture clashes and overcoming these cultural barriers. CQ just gives you a lens and a framework. You can look at it, you can articulate it, you can define it, you can help others see it. It's just a way that, helps you to build that foundation in your church so that your church can live out Revelation 7 and engage a world out there that's increasingly diverse. Really, that's really the bottom line. So it's just the ability to function, relate effectively in those situations where people are not like you.
When you talked about the Bible being full of all the culture, I mean, this is sort of a little bit of a rabbit trail. I don't want to go down it, but one of the most valuable tools that I've used is a cultural background study Bible. And, you can read a passage and then refer to, that explains why people reacted that way. And so what you're saying with cultural intelligence, it's for life, just in general to have that. I'm a little curious. You were telling us your, kind of call to ministry, call to Mosaic Church. Why do you think that when you heard the vision for multi-ethnic church that grabbed you so much? And then, we're talking a little bit before we went live about how you could just talk, basically you could talk forever about this, about cultural intelligence. Like, what is it that makes this so fascinating, so essential for you? I'm just curious.
I think a lot of it is just the wiring from which God made me. I'm an analytical up here, but at the same time, it gave me a very tender heart for people down here. What's interesting is I find those two in tension a lot. It's like it's like the struggle between what I know is right versus what I feel is right, and so there's this ongoing tension as I struggle between the analytical and the data and all the macro, all the demographics, and yet know how hurting people are and what my response should be as a shepherd to people, all of that. So there's that kind of weird dynamic going on that, and like I kind of said about my research area, I'm the kind that really likes a juicy project, where it's like, hey, this has never really been done before. And that's the way Mark really painted it. It's like, this is kind of like a one of a kind, first of a kind church. And it's not going to happen overnight. And nobody's really done it before. And there's probably not a whole lot of books to help us along the way. And that's exactly the way it was. We call ourselves a living laboratory. And for me, it was just so much, well, it is really a lot of fun, but it's also extremely painful, right? Because I was very naive when I rolled into Little Rock in 2002, thinking I'm going to help change the world, right? Thinking that, you know, God is going to use me. And it took God, like, I'd say a good 10 years to beat all the stuff out of me, and my people pleasing, my insecurities, just to show what I needed, who I needed to be to lead a church that was this diverse. And it was extraordinarily painful personally. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, for sure, because there's always drama, there's always conflict, there's always, you know, the chance for the enemy to slip in there and disunify. And there's just takes so much constant work, discipline, humility, all those different things. And so I think one of the things that really just piqued the deepest part of who I was, one was just the fact that it was just this picture Mark painted of a church that I'd never heard before that sounded really fascinating. I tell people I knew that when I got here, it was going to take a long time and a very large effort. And what this is my long-term thinking at play. This is my own cultural values that was instilled in me by my Chinese father and my Chinese mother. You know, what I knew it'd take at least 10 years. I knew it was probably going to take more than that. And what I told God in that first, after I got a full understanding of how hard this church was going to be to build, I told the Lord, I said, okay, this is going to be really hard. And here's what I'll commit to you right now. I will not quit. The only way I will take that you want me to stop doing this is if the elders of this church fire me. And I said, other than that, you got the next 10 years of my life. I won't even question the call. I'll just keep sowing and plowing. And then at year 10, we can have another talk, right? But I tell you, I should have been fired 100 times over, and the elders never fired me. I was so young, so immature. So much had to happen over those 10 years, man. And I'm so glad I made that original commitment, because I wanted to quit a whole bunch of times, you know.
And you're Harry's mentor. If you're with us jumping in, I see some are with my friend Harry Lee with the Mosaic Church and talking about cultural intelligence. We've heard about Harry's call story, and I forgot we're in the gospel and film for having a little fun for 4 teaching series, and so each of the pastors are taking their favorite movie and where do we see the gospel in, and people are trying to guess what that is out of our top 5. I'll just say calling is really important in mind for this Sunday. So it's good to hear something about Harry's call. But Terry, was a great question that what just emerged in you, and I think I really call it Harry, and I don't want to get too sidetracked on this, because it was the same with me and with my wife. It's almost a memory trace back to who we were supposed to be. You know, I really am contending in something I'm writing over. There were 2 falls of humanity. One was the fall in the garden. Everybody talks about that. But the other was a corporate fall when we tried to build a tower, you know, make a name for ourselves. And there was a scattering. And I think Jesus's church was the answer to bring that scattering back together as one. So I'm with you on that. So let's get back to CQ a little bit, that this resource then obviously was something that's close to your heart as you're teaching and training. And I know David Livermore, there's kind of 4 quadrants of what we measure. And I think those are really helpful. I've always felt Strength Finders, Myers-Briggs is great. I've done all of them, but it's so cumbersome. Strength Finders made it pretty plain. I think CQ makes it really plain. There's other resources like IDI. I'm not talking bad about them, but CQ made it plain because they can't put in 4 quadrants how we measure our own personal ability, desire, et cetera, to operate in this Revelation 7:9 preview that we're living in. So talk about those 4 quadrants. You can just give us kind of the brief overview.
Yeah, so really it's a highly generalized model. I mean, you can apply these 4 quadrants and these 4 steps to almost any process. And it's really just focused on these 4 things related to you're engaging people not like you. So the first thing it measures is how motivated are you to do it? Just like how motivated are you to grow in Christ in the same way. And this one, it measures like, do you intrinsically derive enjoyment? I think of all the things that I used to do when I first got there, at Mosaic. Like one of the first memories I have when I arrived in Little Rock was going into this little trailer court we were doing ministry in. I could not speak a lick of English, but there were people that had visited our church from there. It turned out being the cornerstone of our entire Hispanic ministry. And just sitting in a trailer with women, older women that I could not understand, trying to figure out if they could use a donated dryer, that somebody gave us. And me getting on my cell phone, calling my best friend back in Idaho and said, who did know Spanish, and say, hey, be my virtual missionary and translate this conversation. Ask this group of women if they need a gas-powered dryer. And so it's just back and forth. And when we got done with that, I left there just thinking, man, this was so much fun, right? There was just this intrinsic enjoyment from this crazy, awkward interaction. So it measures that as part of the assessment. It also measures, the extrinsic, which is how much benefit do you actually see from these kinds of engagements. And so, of course, this is where a lot of churches that I help, you see if there's hesitancy in that score, right? Because so many times, especially for the churches that have been around for a while, their culture is well built. They have, they're convinced that their mission is dead on, and it is. But a lot of times it's limited by the cultural bubble that they've been operating out of. And so there's this hesitancy to expand that mission because they're thinking deep down, there may be a cost to this that's where we're going to compromise our core values, the gospel, our mission. Mm-hmm. And so I can usually see that in those scores, and when we talk to churches, and so I spend a lot of time reassuring them that, hey, this is really, there's a way to do this without you compromising anything you believe strongly in, So it measures that. It measures how much you actually know. I mean, it's usually a lower score for people that have been inexperienced in diverse others, but it's also one of the easiest things to fix because you can read, you can learn those kinds of things. So it measures how much you actually know about other cultures. It also measures how strategic are you when you meet with people that are not like you. Do you actually plan and think ahead? Mm-hmm. Just even that short little thing will improve the engagement so much. If you're just thinking stuff like, okay, what kind of worldview do they have? If you think, how do they view me as a pastor? Do they see me as an authoritative position? Do they see me as their friend? I mean, all of those things are super critical because it keeps you from sticking your foot in your mouth. Essentially, if you can just think culturally about where that person's viewing you, how they're viewing you, what they're like, what their background is like, then you can kind of strategize that so that it leads to a much quicker, more effective relationship. I just say it just leads me as a pastor to know how to minister, know how to lead, inspire, encourage people not like me. Because, hey, I already know, very few people like to be loved the way I like to be loved. And very few people like to be inspired the way I like to be inspired. So I have to find ways beyond myself to reach, communicate, inspire, motivate, love people that are not like me. And then the last thing it measures is how adaptable are you? How much action you willing to put into this? Really, the bottom line action for what CQ measures is all those thoughts up here that shouldn't necessarily be here, that are kind of coming out of our heart of flesh and our sin nature. And it tries to keep you from letting those thoughts come out here. And it really, it's like, minimizing foot and mouth disease. Really, that's the way I describe it.
You know, Garfield's going to think, and Pastor Chip is actually trained in this. Well, I put the ones in the chat out there that what CQ calls them as Harry's saying, is this in your bones? Do you care? Are you into this? They call that drive. Knowledge is, what knowledge do you have, and cross-cultural competence. Actually, Americans test pretty low in this. It was my lowest score of everything I did. We're so monolinguistic. We only speak one language. Most of the people in the world speak multiple languages. Something, as you said, my knowledge could go up even if I just study it. If I really wanted to take up another language. One of our Young Mosaics pastors, well, actually 3 of them in our cohort, you'd be interested in Ohio, Harry, 2 in the Columbus area and 1 in the Akron area. The Bhutanese community is really, really growing in Ohio. And there are 3 of our cohort churches that we teach have enormous amount of Bhutanese coming in. A young man down in the Akron area, he went and studied Nepali. He's fluent in their language.
That is awesome.
Yeah, his CQ, can you imagine what his knowledge went?
Yeah.
And then strategy, we have a question about that. But as Harry was saying, thinking about, okay, we're going to be in this engagement. When I was a superintendent, I suddenly had a Korean congregation and that I was overseeing. And I asked my 2 predecessors, who were both white males like me, white European Americans, hey, talked about the Korean church, and all, what they told me? They said, oh, we just go there and smile a lot. Well, for my wife and I, that wasn't good enough.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to be their supervising elder, and my wife is this way. Here we are, your team. I don't want to just sit there and smile. So I really had to immerse myself in Korean culture. And we became their favorite whatever for whatever reason. But I think it was because we always stayed and ate the food and
yes,
homes. And when they would begin arguing in Korean and I didn't speak it, whereas my other predecessors would smile a lot, I'd be like, excuse me, I don't know what you're saying and I'd like to engage. And so it became, but I think about just how much, and this was way before CQ, I had to really plan going in and do meetings there because I didn't want to be offensive. I'm a hugger. And I know a lot of our Koreans at Garfield, like I'll go to hug and that's like, oh, wait,
yes.
So I think that's part of the strategy. And then action, am I going to take action in this? So I put those in the chat. Barb Smith here asked a good question, Harry, about strategy. When you're pre-planning, when you're thinking these through, as I just said, she says, is there ever a time when it will come naturally? I think it's a good question. How would you say?
Yeah, I mean, really what CQ is like taking you from being consciously competent, right? Where you actually are thinking all the time about this to where you actually become unconsciously competent, where it becomes second nature to you. And you just, you run through all these thoughts, but by the time you've done it so many times, it's almost like it's an intuitive march after a while. I mean, of course, I've been doing this for, I've been studying CQ for 7 or 8 years now. I'm nowhere near that. I still seriously think a lot, strategize a lot, and plan a lot. But definitely it gets easier the more you do it. And especially when there's nothing that improves the speed of the development of this like loving somebody that's just so incredibly different than you, man. You get to love them. You're going to be so highly motivated to know things about them, to enjoy the foods that they eat, to look at the way they love their family and how different it is from the way we loved our families. All those different things we've talked about so many times, Chip and I. And like I remember in the training, they said, what was the thing about Thanksgiving about your family? And for me, it was like, I didn't realize until I was probably 10 years old that Americans didn't eat Peking duck for Thanksgiving. It was such a shock to me and such a disappointment because I ate turkey and it was just like, what in the world is that? That is so dry, man. I wanted my Peking duck. So stuff like that, just understanding, knowing, and especially just being motivated out of love. I mean, that's the best way to progress on all those fronts.
Well, I'm gonna make you talk about that love, and I'll let you how far you want to go, because when Harry took us to that, and the greatest of these is love. And that came from Paul, who was figuring out how to be cross-culturally competent, right? But Harry really testified to us about love being that ingredient in his journey as a lead pastor in the multi-ethnic church. And we'll close with that in about 20 minutes or so. But I want to give a story, since I've asked you to share that, and we'll talk a little bit before you do about cultural values and get there. But my father-in-law recently passed. My wife is African American. My father-in-law was a son of a sharecropper in North Carolina. My mom growing up in apartheid in Alabama, and here all of a sudden they, with the great black migration to the north, the steel company's a job. Now here one of their 5 children decides, I'm going to marry this white guy from Youngstown, or date this white guy from Youngstown. And they lived in Canton, and I did all the proper things before parents, and you get the interview and the whole deal, and I passed all the tests. My father-in-law just wanted to know I'm a hardworking guy and not a bum, out to date his daughter. And I passed the test and just became so close. But I'll never forget the first time I sat at his table. And this gets me a little teary, and I shared this at his homegoing just this past year. We were sitting at the table, and he wanted to make conversation, and he said, "Hey, Chip, do you know Elvis?" And I said, "Well, like, not personally," And he, "Oh, I love Elvis," and he started talking about Elvis's songs, and we had a conversation, and I thought it was so bizarre. And then looking back on it, I realized he was doing cultural intelligence strategy. He was thinking about the only kind of white person he knew that was, popular. And this was going to be a way to begin a relationship with my white son-in-law, like open the door. Man, dude, I just thought that was, I didn't get it until looking back. And the man was the man told me he loved me so many times, it just broke my heart. But he would call me, look in the wrong number to call my wife. And I'd say, "Hey, Dad, I'm in a meeting." Like, oh, like, is Terry there? "No, I'm in the meeting." "Oh, sorry, love you, son. Like, it would be a wrong number, and I'd get that love. But I thought that was just so endearing looking back, that he didn't know it. He didn't have more than an 8th grade education, but because it was motivated by love, he cared a lot to try to do some strategy that wouldn't, create this. And even though he and my mother-in-law both grew up in American apartheid, I just thought that was saturated in that.
It kind of goes to show that, like, so much of this can be natural. It really is born out of a heart of love, man. You just want somebody, you love somebody, you're going to want to know and understand them. And, so much of what we do is just give people ways to talk about it, so they recognize it. Like, you probably, if you hadn't been through CQ, you probably would have never remembered that story. I have a very, very similar story with my father-in-law, and me wanting to feel wanting to win him. Even this is way before I was CQ, right? And the first thing I knew, he was an Ohio State fan. And so the night before I drove to Ohio to meet him, I saw an Ohio State basketball team game on TV, and I sat there and watched it and memorized every player, and just memorized as much as I could as the commentators, talked about Ohio State. And within 5 minutes, he brought up the game. And I immediately just started rapporting with him about Ohio State basketball and everything I'd learned. Of course, that's the NASA researcher part and all this. But he loved me from then on. He was a great father-in-law.
That's amazing. Hey, Terry, before I go on to the next, I see Sherry, you were mentioning, had a question.
Yeah, she said, how do I find out how my CQ is? So.
Yeah, so there's a website, and of course Chip is one of the facilitators. You could easily get an assessment through him. You can do it individually. You can also do it collectively. What's really powerful is that the assessment has the ability to take a group, 10 or more people, leadership staffs, executive boards, entire churches, and they can all do it, and then it comes up with a composite report that kind of gives you the overall flavor of the culture of that group. And so you can do it for yourself individually, you can do it as part of a leadership group or part of just an exercise in terms of development. One really interesting thing about all of that is that after you do it all, it's certainly not it's not the cure-all. It's not a silver bullet, but it is definitely like an MRI. It kind of shows you where you are. It's just a snapshot of where you are, and then you can start asking the right questions.
Right. When you do it, you get a report kind of personalized where you're at and all these different levels, and it's wonderful. And I think here, before we kind of end with why love is the glue, that as I mentioned with our story and what you've learned about that, because both of us, pastoring very, very diverse churches, our two roles at Garfield is you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And our second rule is you're going to like 70% of what happens here. So living in that kind of tension that we will ourselves to live in, you ministered to me, like all these are tools. We've had over 700 go through multi-ethnic conversations. That's been medicinal. If you've not been in a multi-ethnic conversation group, whether at Garfield or somewhere else, we can talk about that. CQ is going to be a resource. As I said, our pastoral team went through it, but we're going to do a lot more with it. And we may turn to you because you can't be a prophet in your hometown. You know that. So I need your help. They'll just think this is another chip gig or whatever. But let's talk a little bit about the cultural values, because as you were mentioning, these things that we bump into each other in, just these cross-cultural engagement, lack of awareness, lack of knowledge. Boy, oh boy, if you go into social media and you go into our whole political landscape, this is just contributing to the mess.
Totally.
White folks are trying to speak about Black Lives Matter with absolutely no cultural competency. African Americans sometimes maybe don't understand the individualistic nature of, where somebody was raised in Appalachia, and, it's all about getting up at 4 a.m. to get the corn in. And I think our misfires are so exasperating. As you said, the enemy's just going to use all this. He waited for an opportune time, right? After and he found something in Judas's heart that wasn't quite right, and he got in there and exasperated it. So talk a little about those cultural values. I know there's 10 of them, but the individualist collectivist that's right where we're living in America right now. So maybe give us a tease of that, and just what do we learn about these cultural values?
Yeah, well, it's like we always say, if you can just get a grasp on the differences in the mindsets between individualism and collectivism, that's so much a big part of the entire game. I mean, it's like you're beyond the 50-yard line if you can just grasp those two concepts.
Tell our folks what those are and how that plays.
Yeah, so an individualism is simply you're concerned about individual rights, responsibilities, and goals. And so, like, it's good old American, and they call it rugged individualism, right? It's every man for himself kind of thing. That's individualistic thinking. On the other end of the spectrum is highly collectivistic thinking, right? Which is, it's all shared. It's shared responsibilities, shared goals, shared roles, all those kinds of things. And it's, the assessment has shown that by ethnic group, it shows the great divide, because most Caucasians in America, highly individualistic. Most people of color in America, highly collectivistic. Okay. And it's like the whole, it takes a village thing. And really, if you think about like even the roots of it, I think a lot of that comes out of, Nordic, cold, Scandinavian, European type climates where everybody hunkers down past a certain time and they're focused on their family and keeping their family fed, keeping their family warm, versus the warm climates where everybody's outside all the time, all year, and you're watching not just your kids, but everybody else's kids. And it just becomes a lot more entangled with regard to the relationships, and so it's just a collectivistic society. So the issue of our day, of course, that shows us is the face mask issue. And it's like, because the individualists are over there going, no, this is about my individual rights, and the collectivists are going, no, I'm sorry, this is about our health. And before you can even begin the argument, the two are discussing and thinking on two completely different planes. And so what I feel like so much of my job at Mosaic and just as a pastor of all these diverse people is trying to intercept those culture clashes before they become personal offenses. Because if you can just understand why and how a person is thinking about an issue, that will help you a long way respond without going, you're just selfish, and the other one going, man, you're just naive. I mean, and whereas it's not, is they're just thinking two different things, two different values. Okay, so the cultural values piece essentially helps you define the water you're swimming in, and for most people who've been living in a particular culture, especially the longer you've been living in it, and we're talking church culture, your own personal culture, upbringing and background, can be a company culture, the harder it gets for them to even think about how to articulate what that culture is. It's just like asking the fish to define the water that it's swimming in. And most fish are going to say,
What water?
Yeah, there's water. Much less they're going to go, you mean there's actually fresh water and salt water and, all those different things. And so it's just one of those things. It's just an eye-opening thing. I always just say the leaders who can define and articulate and shape culture, they're going to be the clear winners going forward.
That's so good. And so, Terry, be ready if you have a question or a thought for Harry. And then we're going to wrap this up. I'm not going to keep Harry more than an hour after I sat with him and had to watch his brother pine away for 12 hours, days, just on this with one church, one mega church in Indianapolis. But and those of you who are out there, if you want to throw in another thought or something before we wrap up, but we're gonna wrap this up. But it was interesting, and these cultural values show up. Where are you on the spectrum? It's good to know that, because there were a lot. I mean, there were a couple Anglo values that I was right in the wheelhouse, and there were some I was so far away from Anglo values. So it's not just that, but it's good to know trends. And it was interesting when you said that, it was the African proverb that got pretty popular within particular groups in the 80s. It takes a village to raise a child. Mm-hmm. Mary Edelman, is an African-American woman in education that first started bringing that proverb, and it was picked up by many. But there was a conservative reaction to it. Oh, no, it doesn't take a village. It takes a family.
Right. It's your responsibility.
Right. And it's just, you just articulated individualistic and collective.
That's exactly right.
That's really, really good. Terry, any thoughts? And before we, you're muted.
I just think it's so helpful to, get our eyes open to the fact that we live in a culture, because, growing up, like I didn't think I had a culture, right? Because we weren't, my maiden name was Giovinco. We were theoretically Italian, but I always thought I was a WASP. I lived in a Jewish neighborhood in New York. I mean, but I realize now I definitely had a culture. But I couldn't see it because I was the fish in the water. And so to begin to learn about it, and I'm really captured by and I know you're going to talk more about the love part, but because it can be easy with an assessment, like, well, it's a social science tool and it's a this and it's that, but it's based on love. And I think about, we did a big study or a big initiative on temperaments last fall with Kathleen Edelman. And it's, I said this, you heard that. And it's, discovering what your temperament is and how that affects how you talk and how you listen. And the reason that we do it is to love one another better. Well, that's an individualistic manifestation, but I can see the cultural intelligence as a collective manifestation of being able to love each other better. And I love that. And I think it's amazing. And I'm so captured when you said that one line about growing up with two Chinese parents, and that when you walked outside the door, you were like a Southern good old boy. And when you walked in the house, it was a traditional Chinese family. And I almost wonder if that is part of what made you so passionate about this? Like, because you've always been navigating multiple
Yeah,
worlds, you know,
yeah,
when you, it
and it
sounds
was
like to me.
I did it so much, it just was so natural. That's where the first question was, how does it ever become natural? The answer
Right.
is yes, the more you do it. And so for me, especially, I didn't even realize till many, many years later just how easy it was for me to walk into a group of, people speaking Chinese and just feel so at home.
Right.
Even though my parents didn't speak Chinese to each other, we always, when they did have the Chinese that could speak Cantonese or Shanghainese, they would speak Chinese or Mandarin for my dad. And so that's when I realized I was kind of like a reverse, what they call the third culture kids, the missionary kids that go overseas and they live and they
Hmm.
have a household that's largely, American if they're American missionaries, but they're in this different culture and they call them third culture because they learn to go back and forth between those two very
Yeah.
naturally. That's the way I was raised, but kind of inversely, here in America. But it can definitely be learned.
Yeah. And I sense, our African American brothers and sisters learned have learned to adapt to do that just to survive. You know,
Yes,
can't speak
for
to that,
sure.
but just from talking to friends. And so I think it's time for all of us to begin to develop more cross-cultural competence again out of love. So I want to hear what you want to say on that.
Yeah, we're going to close with that. And I'm putting Harry on the spot, but I know people are just jumping in. I keep seeing you. And again, we're with Harry Lee. You can watch us on demand. Most people do. We find out, aren't with us live, but it's on our Facebook Live page or just our church Facebook page. You stay up there indefinitely. So if you want to play this again or you want to think about it, or if you'd like to know more information, some of you pastors that are in here say, we'd like to think about this at our church. We're going to expand on this at Garfield with our staff and others. But Harry and I share something together in this multi-ethnic church movement, knowing we're moving to the Revelation 7:9, whether we like it or not. We'd rather start practicing now. People say to us often, well, I don't know if I'm just comfortable in that kind of church. Under our breath, we want to say, boy, you're going to be uncomfortable in heaven. And then I heard Ed Stetzer say at the Mosaics conference, but maybe you won't have to worry about that. But that's tongue in cheek. But Harry's, navigated this. We've navigated at Garfield. There's always misunderstandings. There's always, when we're in that world, that's why a lot of people don't try it. I think G.K. Chesterton was so right when he said, it's not that Christianity's been tried and found too difficult. It's been found too difficult and never tried. I think that's kind of in the multi-ethnic world. Oh my gosh, we're gonna get those groups together? No, I'd rather be in my lane with people that look like me and vote like me and go to school in my places. And so this does create tension that we live in. But here you brought down to earth and gave an illustration. If you want to go on that, that's fine. If you don't. But why love is the final ingredient. I think of Peter, who blew it so many times. He's the one that wrote, love covers a multitude of sins. How you've experienced it, that love ingredient. This is a tool, this is a resource that's great, but how that thing can finally bring us closer to that beloved community.
Yeah, well, the basis of all of that was the fact that, we've been in so many messy situations over the years. I mean, hurtful. When you start talking race, ethnicity, socioeconomics, and there's all this offense, especially in the name of Christ, right? It's like it just can get deeply, deeply wounding. And I saw that so many times. And this is, of course, I've done it many times since CQ, but even pre-CQ, my understanding of CQ, I would just always sit back and just beg God, just show me how would you do this? What would Jesus do in this moment where there's so much pain between believers? I mean, that's the part that was really bothering me. And every time I would ask him, like, what would Jesus do? It didn't matter how complex the situation was, because they were extremely complex. They were cross-cultural. Sometimes it had to deal with people that couldn't speak English as a first language. Sometimes it had to do with poverty. Sometimes it had to do with, deep racial divides. And every time I would ask that question, I would always get back the same answer. I've already shown you what I would do, right? And the first time he told me that was when I was in a conflict with one of our staff members. He was an African American man, and he and I were just from different worlds, completely different worldviews, not too much unlike Jew and Gentile. I mean, just we saw life differently. We liked different foods. I describe him, he was such a natural leader. You know, when kids would be around him, they would just immediately look and see if he was watching them when they scored a basket. And when I was walking into the room, he'd walk in the room, all heads would turn. And when I walked in the room, no heads would turn. And so it was that kind of, there's just a big dichotomy in personality and culture and worldview. And we got into it over a bunch of different things early on. And I remember us being so frustrated with each other. And a lot of it was around the race issue and how we understood each other. And there was a lot of hurtful things said in those initial exchanges, and enough to where, we scheduled lunch on our day off to just try to resolve these things. And we just basically said, if you and I can't figure this out, what hope do we have for the church? I mean, that's really what we concluded at lunch. And I said, let's just be committed to keep trying to work it out. And he said, okay, yeah, I'm with you. And so then I would just happen to be preaching that Sunday, and you know how God tests everything that you preach on. And it was in John 13. It was all about the new commandment. And, when I studied that, it was like, this is a new commandment. This has never been done before, because two people have never had me in them and had to love each other like I am about to show you how to love. And so my commandment is, from believer to believer, you better love each other the way I have been loved. And up until that point, that had never been defined in Scripture, if you think about it. He talked about loving our neighbor. He talked about loving your enemy. He talked about loving God, loving him. But never was there a case where it's like disciple to disciple. And so this is like, okay, here's a new commandment. You love each other the way I've loved you. And so I was preaching on that Sunday, and I'm like, I'm going to have Amos let's just be honest. Even if we can't figure it out, we're just going to be honest about where we are. And so I called him and said, hey, you want to come up with me on Sunday, and we'll just talk about where we are and the journey we've been through. And, we'll just let people know we're human, we're working through it, we're learning. He's like, sure. And then Sunday morning I woke up and I was reading through the chapter again and realized, oh yeah, let's see, he washed feet just slightly before he said that new commandment, number one. And number two, he washed the feet of his betrayer, his own disciple who had hurt him. So, Christ already knew he was going to be betrayed. So all that hurt and woundedness, from the feeling of somebody that you have actually poured into and loved, was there. And yet he still did it. That was just mind-boggling to me, that Christ in that moment would choose to do that. And then I was like, are you asking me to do that? And then I read, okay, so I've done this as an example for you to follow. And I was like, I don't know if I can do this, but I went ahead and planned it in the middle of the service, preaching all this stuff on love. And then I call Amos up and we talk about our conflict as best we can, as honest as we could. And then I sat him down right there and said, here's what I know I have to do. This is what Christ told us he did. He's leaving it for an example. And I'm just going to do it. And so I sat him down and washed his feet on that Sunday morning. And I've never seen a man just weep so heavily in that moment, And I was crying too, but not just us two. I mean, there was wailing coming from the entire congregation, unlike I mean, just loud, open sobbing. It was so, still can't tell the story without breaking down myself. It was such a powerful moment, you know, and I felt like it was healing to the church. It definitely healed our relationship, and just, you know, I'll never forget. That's the part that just to this day just gets to me. He's like, when the service is over, he and I are sitting in the front row, and he just puts his arm around me, you know, and he just says, from here on out, you're my brother. You're back.
That's
And
incredible.
so I'm sorry. This is like the third time I've broken down trying to tell that story in the last 2 weeks. But
And I feel like I'm manipulating you as my friend to make you tell it. But I just think it's so important, Harry, and you know that. But look how the residue this has in you and your ministry. It wasn't our ingredient. This was Christ instructing you, and through you instructing us how we do this thing finally. Because if it's not supernatural intervention, right?
It is definitely supernatural.
It's not going to happen. And I feel that way because, you know, I Mark does so much in the epistles. I do so much with the book of Acts. I stay in that Lucan narrative. And, you know, we kind of romanticize the book of Acts. Oh, you know, let's go back to the book of Acts. They had all kind of problems doing this. And, you know, when I look at Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, and I look at Peter with Cornelius, and I look at Peter and John going down to Samaria, like this wasn't their idea. The Holy Spirit was driving it. And he was taking these culturally inept Jewish men and saying, hey, you see that ethnically different, sexually altered Ethiopian over there? They didn't have anything to do with it. You know, join with them, you know, and the Holy Spirit sets us up. And just thank you for sharing that. We're at our time, folks. If you're jumping in and you haven't had a chance to watch us, go back on demand. I tell you, Harry, we've known each other, haven't spent a lot of time together. I'm just gonna tell you, man, I love you from the bottom of my heart. I'm learning a lot from you, and I'm just looking forward to spending more time with you. And this is going to be manipulative too, but you know we're going to pray for you, and we pray for the Mosaics movement. But because you're sitting in Cleveland right now, I'd be remiss if you just you know, being a missionary in Cleveland, didn't know you're going to be here. Maybe as we close, just offer up a prayer for our city and our world out of this, what you've learned about love. And closes.
Absolutely. Lord, we thank you for being who you are, and just for providing us all we need. I mean, I can't remember the number of times when I knew things were so messy and all I could do was what you did, and how you supernaturally broke through in those moments, and you healed and you restored and you allowed supernatural forgiveness and love to flow in those rooms where there was just 10 minutes before deep animosity and pain and hurt. And it just showed me over and over and over and over how your Holy Spirit is able to do those things so supernaturally. And so we pray that over the whole Garfield Church, over Cleveland, Ohio. We know there's been lots of historic animosity in Cleveland. And I pray you would continue to heal and to restore, and that people would understand that, man, we fall in love with who you are and everything about you. There will be so much reconciling going on between people who are not like each other. And so give us the power to forgive and to love and to keep trying in spite of our own faults, in spite of our insecurities and all that the enemy's trying to do to divide us. We pray against that. Pray that all believers and around America, in Cleveland, would see and recognize your hand, your voice, your character, and reject divisiveness.
Yeah.
And we thank you. Thank you for Chip and Terry and their long-standing partnership and dedication to all this. Would you fill them with joy and just a sense of rest and being able to sleep at night, knowing that they are living in the middle of your call, and that your grace would cover them and fill them and allow them to sleep well, and to know that they are doing everything you've asked. And we rest in all of that. And we thank you and we pray it in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you so much, brother, for a busy week. Spend an hour in Cleveland. This has been one of my favorite Faith on Fridays.
Oh, I'm glad.
We want to shout out to everybody. We'll see you guys all next week.
Bye, you guys.